Welcome to Cane Roots Art Gallery, presenting on the Callaloo Network, Culture TV, and Temple Network. We are bringing to you Conversations Art over Bush Tea. And in the art gallery today, we have artist Lavon Bao. Welcome, Lavon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I am particularly happy to have you here today because I met you when I arrived in St. Croix in 2016, and you said, "Oh, why don't you come to my gallery?" And it's always really nice when an artist says, "Come visit my gallery," because when an artist has come to visit your gallery, it becomes the personal conversations, the talks, what they love about what they do, what inspires them, and you're actually moved. And actually, I would say that day I was particularly moved by your work and what you were producing. And I think you were moving on to doing a very big project, which was the Queen Mary project.
Yeah.
And when I left that day, this is the piece that I wanted most that you had done. And it's a copy of an original. It's a numbered series, and it talks about we live in the fragments. And I was very touched by We Live in the Fragments because I think we, the people in an African diaspora, we live in the fragments. We live in the fragments from a psychological space, from a spiritual space, from all aspects of our culture. So even like the chainy that you created here and the chainy that I'm wearing, this is not a polished piece of chainy. It's actually a fragmented piece. It just symbolizes so much of how we had been forced to lead our lives. And still, some of us are reckoning to how we lead our lives right now. So maybe I think if we can break in, I mean, I'd like to go back a little further with you in your career as an artist, but if we can start from the chainy part, that's where I met you and admire that part of your work.
Well, maybe I should go back even further, just talking about, what kind of work that I do. And so, I think there's always this debate if people are born artists or if they develop into that. But I mean, I always had some artistic talent. I think that came from generations. But, for me, I see my practice as a way to engage in dialogue. It's like a way to develop knowledge in ways that only I think the practice of making objects and thinking through space and narratives are able to do. And, this particular project, I think a lot of my work has been transformed in almost what have kind of also brought you to St. Croix, right? Living in this space and being around a place that has been very impacted by colonialism and trying to understand through the material culture of colonialism, or what I call coloniality, what does this mean for us as Virgin Islanders, as people of the Caribbean, and how do we begin to move out of this state of being colonial subjects? Because in some ways in the Virgin Islands, we still are in a colonial relationship with the United States. So that's kind of the preface to kind of how I see myself as an artist. And because it's so more concept-based, I work in many different media. I do painting, I do video, I do performance, I've done big public art projects because really, again, it's more thinking through these ideas. And so it's the idea that will then dictate the form. One of the things that impacted me very, very much was, as an artist here in the Virgin Islands, I needed to find a way to sustain myself and my practice. It's expensive to live here. And I knew that if I always had to be paying rent somewhere to have a studio, that would change the kind of work that I made. So I decided to invest in trying to buy a property. I bought what was called, these 2 damaged houses in the back streets, not too far from where we are. And that totally transformed my practice and my art, because unbeknownst to me, when I bought the property, it ended up being in a part of Christiansted that was, all of the town is historic, but this was very uniquely historic because it was part of a neighborhood called Free Gut. which is where the very first people who were able to get themselves out of slavery, where they were relegated by law to live. And the house that I had just purchased to have as a studio, which was decrepit, had a fire in it, the first registered owner was from the 1700s. She was African born. She survived the Middle Passage. She ended up owning this property in the 1700s, and her life was remarkable. And she wasn't the only one. There were other people who owned that house that had these remarkable journeys. Knowing that totally transformed my relationship to that building. I started to see how there's this incredible connection between narrative and space, narrative and objects, narrative and materiality. And as I spent almost 2 years, I didn't actually make art for 2 years, at least in the way I thought about it. In a way, I was making my art. For 2 years, I spent doing a lot of that renovation work myself. And it gave me this new way of really thinking about these objects like Cheney, the types of fretwork and architectural details that you see in the buildings here, and understanding how that connects to our history.
And the rubbings.
Yeah, and there were all of that work.
You
Yeah.
taught me that day. I
Yeah,
didn't
so
know about
all
that.
of that intense period of renovating that property and having to put my hand on their hand, you know, it was like I was literally kind of touching back into history and having this incredible connection, and that was like a meditation for 2 years, you know, painting, scrubbing, sweeping, and really absorbing and thinking through is. So when the renovation was at a different place where I could start to go back to my work and I started moving things into the studio, here I am coming to the studio and finding little pieces of Cheney that would greet me after it rained very hard. And I would go, oh my gosh, you know, here we get so excited when we find Cheney. And they look like miniature paintings. And it made me think, you know, I just finished this solo exhibition at the National Nordic Museum in Seattle, and that title of that exhibition is called The History of Unruly Returns. Because in some way, these little pieces of colonial pottery that keep resurfacing in the soil, it's like they just want to keep reminding us. It's like an unruly return. They keep returning, they keep telling us about these stories of ourselves and these bodies that were traded like pottery that made that journey across the Atlantic Ocean, like these cups and plates and all these things. It's like they want to they keep talking to us. So this work came out of first finding those pieces of pottery outside my studio and, you know, starting to think about them as these miniature paintings and what would it look like if they were bigger, right? And also what would it look like if I started to piece these fragments together? What would that look like? And so I've been doing that started in about 2015, and I've done different variations of them. I've done like the work that you've seen here, which is a reproduction of a larger painting. And then I have a new series that I've been working on, which are kind of like fragments of fragmented paintings. And you know, Cheney is such a interesting word because it's really, I think, in the Virgin Islands, although these colonial pottery fragments, they're all over the New World. We are the only ones that I know that have a name for them. And our name is a mixture of China and money, because China is really the first country that really started making porcelain, and then money because in the Virgin Islands, children would take them and they would round them to look like coins, and they would make them be their play money in games. And so we created this hybrid word in the Virgin Islands called Cheney. And so the series is titled after that, but it's also another kind of a layer of a metaphor of me trying to develop a narrative currency, like a visual currency about who we are as a people and the ideas that are being exchanged in the work. So as you mentioned, when you introduced the work, talking about how we can see them as representations of our Caribbean identities, our European, our African, our indigenous identities, our Asian identities, all of these groups of major civilizations that kind of met here. And that how, you know, it's almost this this process of how do we piece these fragments of who we are together. And I felt that the work, I call them my process paintings, because they're not pre-planned compositions. I'm literally using my imagination, grappling with the loss of that. I may not know where the pattern goes or what the flower is, but I have to kind of use my imagination to kind of piece to get to the next thing. And for me, that's very much reflective of this work that we do as Caribbeans anyway, that we are, you know, we've had to grapple with this loss and this fracture and this shattered histories that we've inherited, but that we're still trying to find ways to piece them all together to create something very beautiful as we move forward.
Yeah, I can relate to that because creating this gallery has been that way for me. Coming to St. Croix, people would say to me, "Oh, why? Why did you choose St. Croix? You know, like you were born in Guyana." Well, St. Croix is the romanticism of my youth. Do I know or understand truly? I can read about it now. What was happening politically in Guyana when I was 10 and 11, and my mother forced my father, and at forthright, she says, "No, we got to get out of here. You know, this is not a place to raise children. It's too much going on. It's too much violence. It's too much happening right now politically. We've got to get out of here." So as a child, not even yet a teenager, who walked with her school friends to school with her school uniform, buying tambourine balls, you know, buying a mango, going to and from school, there's a romanticism of the store underneath and the house on top. That's what I grew up with in Guyana.
Yeah, my grandmother had a store like that in Tobago.
So here being in St. Croix, I think the way I created the gallery was to create the romanticism of what I left behind in Guyana. And the issue with the Cheney, when I started raising the back of the house up, I have come upon almost 2 jars of Cheney.
I can imagine.
So it's that, and I have actually had a green and white piece that I've started to put together, and I started putting the Cheney grouped by color. So it's I've been trying to create my own puzzle with that. So we'll be right back to continue this journey with you as an artist. It's been such a good pleasure talking with you so far.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I used to watch BET, MTV, VH1, now I watch Tempo. Soca, Calypso, Reggae Dancehall. Don't stall, better get tuned in to the tempo. Don't have cable, they got an app. Go to your app store, download that. Whether it's tourism, cuisine, or the social scenes, if it ain't Tempo, it's a rap. Who got the Caribbean views? Tempo. It's the latest in Caribbean news. Tempo. You tryna cook Caribbean food? Tempo. You know they got the music videos too. Tempo. Who got the Caribbean views? Tempo. It's the latest in Caribbean news. Tempo. You tryna cook Caribbean food? Tempo. You know they got the music videos too. Tempo.
Time. It has a different meaning in the U.S. Virgin Islands. It goes backwards, forwards, it stops. St. Croix is rooted in history. So much of it still remains untouched.
I remember running on these streets as a kid. This shop was right down there. It opened the same year I was born. This is where the original Crucian Hook was born. It's the symbol of these islands. And I wanted to have my hands in that very same history. I want to be able to pass it down to my family while still putting a new spin on it.
The U.S. Virgin Islands, we have an amazing culture that developed over time from all over the world.
St. John feels so untouched. Being underwater is like another world. There's no worries, there's no stress. I can just escape. This is my happy place. My passion for scuba diving came at just being fascinated with the water and wanting to be a mermaid. And this is the closest thing I can get to achieving mermaid status. Canadians just love being outdoorsy. We live for adventure, so we love anything hiking, being on the water, diving, snorkeling, and St. John has it all.
It's like some spirit is protecting the island and keeping them raw. The Makujumbi watches over the island. From up there, they keep the evil spirits away. The nightlife in St. Thomas is absolutely amazing. There's always something going on. Everyone comes together to dance and catch a vibe. We're always celebrating. We celebrate freedom, culture, the food, the smell, the music. It's always a celebration. The people here are probably the most priceless thing because they keep the culture going. There's so many different influences on these islands. Food from all kind of countries coming together in new dishes. All of us came from somewhere, but all that we call this home. The VI is a new melting pot. This is where the past and the future comes together.
And we're back to Cane Roots Art Gallery. I'm Sonia Nahardeen, and with me in the gallery today is visual artist Lavon Bell.
Thanks. Yeah.
We're going to continue right back where we left off. But before we start,
Part of the show in terms of bringing you Art Over Bush Tea and the conversation
is to have this ritual about having tea and having tea together. And it's very interesting, we're talking about the colonial past, about colonials having lots of tea, and actually a lot of that tea had a lot of sugar, which we produced for them on unpaid labor because we were enslaved. But if we move forward today and we look back to what our ancestors had and what we have now, it's actually a whole process of making tea out of herbs and bush. So Lavon and I are having what's traditionally, again, Crucian Virgin Islanders bush tea that is picked from a lot of local women from their yards, from their gardens. This one has particularly a lot of lemongrass and other herbs, and I pulled out a lot
I
of the
see,
lemon.
you have bay leaf
Mhm.
and what else is in there?
A few other things,
Things,
and I like to use clove,
Okay,
and I like soursop leaves, because it's very calming.
yeah.
So that's what I tend to put in mine too. So this is our process also to, of paying homage to what grows from the earth and keeps us in a very connected way to what we plant. So welcome back.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. No, I appreciate it. It's always a nice thing to have bush tea. And my children actually also, they make it on their own now. They go outside and they pick the things they want and they make it on their own. So it's a beautiful tradition.
I'll have to get the girls a teapot. So let's continue where you decided as a mother with children and a wife how to create this business with junior artists and doing all the other things that you have to do. That's really incredible when a woman is an artist and she has a family. It's a lot. So you find this building that's in Free Gut, and there's a big history behind it.
Yeah.
A woman who had it in the 1700s.
And even more. I mean, I didn't comment, for example, I was so impacted by the genealogy, the lineage of owners and residents that I decided to do this project. It was called the House that Freedom Built, and I was doing a series of engagements, public engagements, talking to neighbors, finding out histories, writing about the process of renovation so other people could see that it's possible. 'Cause I think people get very scared to do that kind of major renovation where it needs roof, walls, floors, everything.
Tell me about it.
And I wanted to kind of document that process as well. But along the way, historian George Tyson approached me to help, and he had been, he does a lot of research on his own. He's actually the state historian right now. And one day he wrote me and said, "Lavon, I have some other news for you about your building." And when he wanted to meet in person, it was apparently quite big news. And he told me that he had been doing a project looking at death records, because back then, we had found the owners first by the free colored census records. Then we used the registrar records. So matching those two, we were able to get most of the owners and the residents. But then he had been doing another project with death records, which death records back then, people died at home. So that is another way to find out who else might have been living in between census data and things like that. Who else could have been there? And he came across the name Wilford Jackson, who was the father of David Hamilton Jackson. And he died on the property. We don't know which exact house, but it was two little houses. But he really felt secure to tell me that Lavon David Hamilton Jackson was a boy on this property at your place. And for those of you who don't know, David Hamilton Jackson for us is a national hero. We have a holiday named after him. We have other parks and things named after him. He was a tremendous leader for the major labor movement here. Most people know him around the fact that he was the person that developed the free press, which we've seen over the last few years, how journalism is so significant to having a functioning democracy. And in colonial days, if all of the information you're receiving is from the colonizer, it's also a way of oppressing you. So he fought and petitioned to be able for Virgin Islanders to have their own source of press and communication. But that's not all he did. I mean, they also realized that if the Danes are always going to be the ones to own all the sugar plantations, then they are always going to dictate the price of our labor. And so they got together and they started purchasing sugar plantations. That's a part of his story that a lot of people don't know. So here I am being so impressed, obviously, by these women from the 1700s and early 1800s who owned this house that I bought, that I turned into my studio. But I found out a few years after that another freedom fighter for the Virgin Islands also was connected there. And that was a huge, I still have to figure out the process of maybe putting that on the National Historic Register and all of that, but it was very meaningful for me because I really did feel like I was honored to step into this lineage and carry on a different kind of tradition.
Yeah, I think in the whole process, birth records are very, very important. Coming from Suriname, every household has what's called like a stamboom book. So you record who is the mother, who's the father, who are the children, and also you put when the person died. So it really keeps accurate records. And some households, people record it in their Bibles.
Yeah, that's true.
So that, can take you back several generations. So I think having records are very, very important. And I think we're moving away from that. And I think we need to kind of pull that together in terms of keeping family records, in terms of some photographs, some written documentation.
Well, the modern version of what that is.
What is
It's our
that?
funeral booklets.
Yes,
The
actually, I know
funeral
someone who
booklets
collects funeral booklets.
Are that type of document that's created when someone dies that has all the relationships, pictures of their life, so that is the new version of that. And I think that kind of archive is very significant.
Yeah.
And it's a way to counter some of the colonial archives that are being produced. And it's a really wonderful written down document. And I think,
And they're quite elaborate, actually. I did my most recent funeral.
it's like mini books about someone's life. It is.
Exactly.
So for me, as an artist, I actually have come to understand my work as a kind of counter archive to the colonial ones. By me doing this work like Cheney or some of the Cuts and Burns work, for example, what I'm trying to do is to create another kind of archive that registers things like our resistance, for example, in a visual way. So for example, when I was doing my renovation, as I told you, I became really attuned to all the small details, the architectural details in our towns. And one of the things that was so fascinating to me was Christiansted and Frederiksted are they're called twin towns because they're both named after different Danish kings, but then the names, the grid, the layout is very similar. So the names of the streets are very similar, etc. But Christiansted is the first town, and then Frederiksted came later. But Frederiksted is also unique because it had a major event that impacted this development, which was the Firebomb, which in 1878, people rose up, although slavery had been abolished, the conditions were very similar, and people rose up and protested very violently against the living and working conditions that they were under. And they burned down about 50 plantations. They burned down a large part of the town of Frederiksted. And what happened after was, as that town started to get rebuilt, it was done during the time that this gingerbread fretwork was very popular. Yes. And so that's why that town looks different from Christiansted, even though they started off as more like twin towns. When I started noticing that, I'm mostly a East girl, I'm mostly in Christiansted, so when I go to Frederiksted, it always, I found that interesting. And seeing how that history is marked in the town. And I wondered how also I could develop a visuality around this resistance. The fact that most insurrections in the Caribbean were fought with two tools, the same labor tool, the cutlass or the cane bill, machete, however you want to say it, and fire. The Haitian Revolution, they defeated the most powerful army in the world, the French army, with those two tools. I mean, primarily, of course, they had their spirituality and other things, which you can also say is a tool. But I thought, well, how could I visualize that some way? So as an artist, I started using, I found this woodworking tool that is for pyrography, which is to kind of like heat up a pen and it kind of makes a brown mark on wood. And I decided, well, maybe if I crank it up and I use paper, can I get that same cut and burn, those two things that I wanted to try to visualize? So that's how that started. I first started using the architectural patterns that were on the buildings, and I would kind of create a stencil with that, and then I would do these cuts and burns on paper to create another kind of archive, to create another kind of, make another narrative visible. And, you know, that work has taken it's manifested in different ways. I've done it as large ledgers, I've done it as large panels, I've done it as very small, almost like emblems. And in thinking through these narratives about space and how the buildings can kind of hold a particular history, I also really started to reflect on my studio. When I was doing a lot of research about that time period and the people who were freed during the concept of slavery, but these were what they call the manumitted, the people who were able to get their manumission from slavery. And that could have happened by inheritance or by a relationship with a slave master who decided to give it to you. Women were often granted that because maybe they had children for him, and then he was able to then make the children free and her free. There are many different ways that sometimes people sold things and bought their own freedom. But one of the things that I learned was that even though these people were free, they had so many restrictions on them, so many. They could not leave their house after 10. They could not gather in public. The women couldn't wear certain fabrics like chintz or lace because that was too fancy for them, or deemed too fancy. The men had to hunt runaway slaves to maintain their freedom. They had to they couldn't marry whites, and they couldn't have certain businesses. They were only allowed to work in certain industries. So if you think about all of those restrictions placed upon these people, you start to realize that those houses have a very special meaning for them. They're very, very special. Because that, in a way, was their only space of freedom, in a way. Like, what does freedom mean in all of these conditions? And I think we can even extend that to thinking about our modern times as people, descendants of people who are oppressed, and still we have lots of issues with racism today. What does it mean to be free in a Black body in these times? So that work was definitely.
It's very interesting that you're talking about the home. And I think, I don't know about here or other places, but I know in Barbados in particular, there's something called the Chattel House. And the Chattel House has a lot of fretwork, like you're talking about. But what's interesting about the Chattel House, it's movable. So I don't know if the houses here, you know, like you could take your house and move it to the lot next door or whatever, but it seems as though as even if you get your own home or had your own home, things were never anything of a permanence. You never knew if somebody could come and claim your home. You just like right now, what we have an eminent domain. Someone explaining to me that when the bypass was being put in, people were displaced because of eminent domain. I just watched a program where eminent domain was coming through a place in North Carolina, and her uncle was going to be displaced. The whole community was going to be displaced. So the lack of permanency sometimes is just not there even now for us.
We'll be right back. Thank you very much. Article Bush Tea with LaVon Bell. Thank you.
You know you are a hot one. We are lime, we are laugh, we are chat, we no chill, we are hot one. Temperature rise, beer vibes in ya, this a hot one. Link up, connect, does a sweat when you're dead on the hot one. We gonna spice it up like fire.
Hello and welcome. My name is Carolyn Howell, and I'm the executive producer of the Caribbean Food Network, the newest and the most fabulous way to eat, drink, and think food, fun, anything culinary, travel, tourism, you name it, we're in. Right now, I'm standing in Cookology, or at least one of the Cookologies. Cookology is a fabulous recreational and professional way to learn how to cook. And isn't that what we all want to do? Eating is how we keep going. So in a minute, I'm going to introduce you to Maria. Maria is the founder and the owner of Cookology. We're so excited about our partnership and what the Caribbean Food Network is going to do. We can't wait for you to see. So sit tight.
Welcome back with Lavonda, artist. This part of our show, what we're going to do is to capture a small body of Lavon's work, and she is going to be able to tell us what the works are about. You will be able to see it on the screen, and we will be able, Lavon, not we, Lavon, I can tell you I love the work, but Lavon is going to be able to tell you about it. Actually, it's going to begin with the one that I love so much, Fragments.
Yeah, so this work is called, it's from this Cheney series that I mentioned before, thinking about these small colonial shards of pottery that we find in the soil here that have a name in the Virgin Islands called Cheney, which is a hybrid word of China and money. And so this work is taking these, what I almost call these miniature paintings, and taking these fragments and piecing them together. I call them my process paintings because they're not pre-planned compositions. It's literally taking a bunch of these. I don't have a big collection. I hear you have a big one, but I document other people's collections of Cheney. And then what I do is I start looking at the patterns and trying to piece them together, and I kind of just see where it will lead me and go. And for me, I see that again as this process of kind of identity formation, and as Caribbean people we do. And so I think the work after that, let's see, is another version of that work where instead of individual paintings, what I'm doing is I have this long, almost a topography. I call it like, it's almost like a map.
Yes.
So it's a much more horizontal piece, and it's actually taking this concept of fragmentation and putting it inside the way that the work is created. So they're actually first done by making diptychs, and then I rearrange them like a jigsaw puzzle, which is kind of what I'm doing inside the process of making the work anyway, but it's now making it in the construction of the work. And I was able to do this in a project in New York, and it was shown at this place called Brookfield. But, you know, I started working with Cheney in about 2015, and that was leading up to the centennial. And the centennial was the 100-year anniversary of the transfer of the Virgin Islands from Denmark to the United States, which happened on March 31st, 1917. And in 2017, that was the 100th anniversary. I
remember.
Yeah, and the very first time I had this kind of epiphany moment also that inspired this work. The very first time I went to Denmark was in 2008. And I was, I had been there for our artist residency to kind of do investigation and research about the connections between Denmark and the Virgin Islands. And I was wandering the streets looking for the visual connections because we have so many here. I kind of thought Denmark was like that. And it wasn't. It was very hard to find the traces. But I wandered into this store that was called the Royal Copenhagen. And on the third floor of that store, it had a museum where they had these series of plates that went all the way back to the 1700s. And at that moment, I realized, oh my goodness, this is that. It made that connection that these fragments were part of a larger whole. And it just created this sense for me that I saw, wow, and I had this other project where I started investigating to see if the Royal Copenhagen had any plates set up in the Virgin Islands. It did. I did this work called Collectible, reproducing them on paper plates. But that first engagement, I was bold enough in 2017, almost 10 years later, to write to the Royal Copenhagen and ask them if they would do a project with me for the centennial. So instead of doing, they had done one for the 50th anniversary, this kind of plate with a sugar mill on the middle. And I thought we could do something different that really reflects more of our agency. So I pitched to them to actually do a series using my work and my designs with Cheney. And they have said that they don't anymore do commemorative plates as a business model. They didn't find that they were, they moved beyond that. But I actually ended up doing a project with them. One was to be I did what was called the Harold Prize. I designed that. It's a prize given every year that the Queen of Denmark gives to its most distinguished professor at the University of Copenhagen. So I designed it that year using the Cheney designs. It was like an owl, a small porcelain owl. It was a beautiful project. But they also said, well, while you're doing that for us, that commission, you can do whatever you want here. So I got a chance to do this idea of the plates that I'd always been wanting to do. And I made a series of about 12. And so they would call them their unica, so they didn't go into mass production, but that process taught me so much because number one, I was working in their factory, which is a 240 something year old company. I mean, this is a company that was started to give the Queen of Denmark a gift for her wedding. So it was first called the Royal Porcelain Factory, then it changed to the Royal Copenhagen. And here I am, the first Black artist that they've ever worked with, and also the first Virgin Islander. And it really taught me that when I was in their space, realizing that, I was really kind of disrupting their archive. I had kind of slipped into their archive and disrupted it because these patterns that I'm using are not just from the Royal Copenhagen. They're from Germany, they're from England, they're from other countries. And here I am kind of merging it and messing it up and doing my own thing with it. And that was an interesting lesson that I really kind of saw the work also as a kind of a disruption in that particular narrative by putting my subjectivity into it and creating something new. So, those images are dealing with that series. And then, we were talking about in the last segment about this cuts and burns work that I've been doing. And those are coming from, again, the thinking about a visuality around resistance, about the tools of resistance that Caribbean insurrections have employed with the cutting and using the cutlass, and then the burning down the plantations, etc. Yes. And so it's creating another kind of archive by doing these small cuts and burns on paper. But I wanted to say that, intellectually, I had this one image of what that work was. And the very first time I showed that work, I had someone come up to me and she put her hand on my shoulder and she asked me if I was okay. And I was when she said it, I immediately kind of knew what she meant. Because she said, when you look at this work, especially some of the larger panels, and you see really was thousands of cuts and burns, she said it was just so painful. Like you could really feel this, you could feel the time, you could feel the insidiousness of it, and you felt this pain. And so she was wondering, how are you transmitting this? Like, are you okay? Like, what's going on with you? And it was interesting for me because I realized that, of course, I did have a lot going on in my life. My mother was very ill at the time. But how that the cutting and burning is also a psychological response that people have when they are going through a lot of pain. So in some ways, I was kind of channeling like this collective pain in a way, personal and collective in a way, of what colonialism feels like on the body. You can also kind of make that connection to the scarification marks that we see in indigenous cultures. So the work has many layers, and that's something that I really strive for my work to have, that it's not like a one didactic, the work is this, that it has all of these different layers that it could enter from different places.
Well, my layer for that piece, when I saw it, was really from the lash you get on your back from the whip.
It's interesting, because it does create a raised scar from the burn.
And then it burns you. It burns you. So you get whipped, it burns. They throw something else on you, it burns. So actually, when I saw those pieces, I really thought more of the punishment during slavery of being whipped and the burning process of the pain. So that's what that was my layer.
That was your interpretation.
So that was my interpretation in terms of what we had to go through.
And I think being an artist, for me, I think it's very important to have work that is open enough, that creates metaphors that are open enough, that people can have an access point. And it's like, the work is talking about that too. And somebody else can come in and go, but look at the work also references this. I feel like I really also in the next work, which is the piece with the houses, the small houses, that is kind of referencing, of course, my studio space, which comes out of the history of Free Gut and the history of formerly enslaved Africans and that were able to get their freedom in the still slavery period and the kinds of houses that they built for themselves and what that meant for them to have a house for themselves. So when you look at that work, you realize that there's no doors or windows. And so that's the first thing as a viewer. I really wanted to create a space that was proprietary. It was like, it's our space. So there's a limited access in terms of that space. And in addition, that work is created with no glue and no nails. It's using its own tension to hold it up and then these small pins to keep the pieces together. So meaning that there's a fragility to the work. Because I'm also talking about the fragility of freedom and what that, not just in the historical period, but in general, freedom is quite tenuous in our societies, depending on which body, whether it be gender, race, whether it be where we're living. Are we living close to a refinery or not? Like, what does that mean to be free? What you can't breathe in your house? What does that mean to be free?
What does it mean to be free that somebody says you've done something and they burn down your whole town in Tulsa? So, what does it mean to be free? What does it really mean
to be free? So that house is kind of speaking about that tenuousness and that fragility of freedom in certain societies for certain people. It could be if you're an immigrant, what does that mean to be free? If you get convicted and someone can deport you, so it's, but for me, I've heard people say, I had someone ask me once in a presentation, but if you don't know all the history that you're talking about and referencing, how do we engage with that work? And I like to tell the story about the very first time I showed it, a little boy came in with his parents and he said, "Mommy, look, a magic house." And I loved that interpretation because for him as a child, that's what he saw. And in some ways, it is a magic house. I mean, when you think about how people survived and endured some of the most oppressive conditions, it is kind of magical. It becomes supernatural. It becomes you having to go into the spirit realm to understand how people survive these things. And so I think that I love the fact that there's also that aspect in the work as well, because you kind of start to ponder like, how does she make that work? Or is it gonna fall down, or how does it keep itself together? And I feel like that's something that sometimes we all wonder, how do we
Well,
keep
yeah.
ourselves together in
Yeah, and
these times?
we have kept ourselves together. We've kept ourselves together.
And so-
Fragile, in the fragments,
Yeah.
we've kept ourselves together.
So I feel like this next piece is called The Planter's Chair. This is an older work. I did this piece in about 2011, so it's almost 10 years old. And for the first time I'm ever showing it again in an exhibition right now at a space called Blue Star Contemporary in Texas. And this is one of my favorite pieces because it really kind of a work that came right out of my background in Cuba and doing a lot of performance artwork in which people become a part of the art making. So this was done in the Wind Plantation Great House, which is in Frederickstead. It's a restored great house plantation on a sugar plantation. It's now turned into a museum. And it's a polemical space because, when you look at these plantations, many places, it's the great house that's restored, and then you look to see where did the enslaved people live, and it's in the bush somewhere, none of those houses are restored. That narrative isn't always as visible. But this is the narrative, and so that was visible in this space. It was the planter's chair, the narrative of the planters, their opulence, all their wealth. And what I did was I invited people during the opening exhibition that I would take their portrait with Polaroid camera, an actual camera from my childhood from the 80s. And I was able to get film, shipped here and do a series of portraits of people. And what was so interesting, as I mentioned in the very first segment, I see my work as an investigative tool. I didn't know what would happen. I wasn't sure how people would respond. But I learned so much as I watched people try to sit in that chair, which the planter's chair is the ultimate power chair. It has arm rests that fold out and double as footrests. The servitude is embedded in the construction of the chair because you can't undo that by yourself. Someone else is gonna take the foot part out. Someone else is probably gonna take off your boots after you've been watching other people work all day. And so I was really curious, how would people situate themselves inside the chair and inside that history? And I was so surprised myself how gendered the chair was, because if you're a woman and you're trying to sit on that chair and you have on a skirt and you gotta sit like this, like you're in the gynecological exam, it really wasn't comfortable. Very few women sat like that. I wasn't one of them. So you had to kind of watch how a woman would kind of situate herself. You watched how men did it. You watched some people wanted their kids to join them. They wanted their partners to join them in the chair. And each one watching their bodies try to interact with this chair and the history of this chair and the way it's set up was fascinating. Unfortunately, that work got destroyed because that same film was temperamental to our climate. But I was able to, through the documentation I had done, to recreate 4 of them. And so that's what's being shown right now at Blue Star Contemporary. And I had actually done another piece in that show, but the next piece is, this one is called Storm, How to Imagine the Tropicalia as Monumental. And I mean, I started working on this series. I think you actually were interested in one of those pieces from 2015, predating our horrible hurricanes of 2017. But I had really just wanted to take this iconic image of a palm tree and mess it up a bit. What could I do that was different? The way that we are constantly represented as this kind of tropical, sublime, languid
There's
space.
a romanticism built
Yes.
into painting the
Yeah.
palm tree.
Yes, and also just thinking about the romantic paintings and that whole tradition of painting landscape. I really wanted to transform that iconic image. So what I did in the beginning, the first series was taking these very graphic representations of palm trees in a storm, bent but not broken. This kind of perpetual resistance. And they were done with charcoal. And then I started doing them I revisited them during the pandemic as a way of thinking about this collapsing of time and space. And so I had a whole other series that was with like ink washes and multiple horizon lines and kind of thinking about the open complexities of what it means to be a part of the Black Atlantic. And then my studio got damaged in the hurricanes in 2017. I lost a lot of work, and I had saved some of my paper rolls. Some got mold and some didn't, and I saved some of them. And when I started doing this work, I started unpacking some paper to work on them. And I realized that some of the paper was all cracked up and damaged. And I thought, oh my goodness. And then a friend said, well, Lavon, you work with archives. This is like an archive to the storm.
Absolutely.
Why don't you use it in your work?
Exactly.
And so I did. So I started taking that same torn paper and redoing it as these, rethinking that work and doing the same, like landscapes, images, but in this, piecing them together in these fragments and this large collage. Those works are quite large. They're like 6 to 7 feet. I'm showing them right now in an online fair called Atlantic World Art Fair on Artsy. And I'm being represented by Susie Wong, who's a dealer in Jamaica. And so I'm pretty excited about those. I've been really working on those for a while. And then lastly, the work is, it's called For Those of Us Who Live at the Shoreline. And these are a series of digital collages. This was a commission work for us, a commercial space, but this also is pandemic work. So I had made this work thinking about these long walks I was making on the beach and walking along the shoreline and seeing all the plants that are there and how they hold in the soil. And in a way, they hold in our memories. And in a way, they are another kind of archive in the way our bodies are also archives. And so I decided to merge those two. So what you're seeing, those are portraits of me. They're all me in those figures. But so it's my body, my border, but also then all of the plants along the shorelines that hold in the border, the manchineel, the mangroves, the sea purslane, all of those plants that you see there. And it's also, a homage to, to Audre Lorde's very famous poem, A Litany for Survival. The title comes from the very first title of that poem, which is really talking about how do we as people who come from these very oppressed histories, what is the process of how we survive them? And so I'm kind of gesturing with using these plants of the borderline. I'm kind of gesturing that it is this process of letting some things go and holding some things in. It's the process of what the mangrove does, of cleaning using the roots to kind of clean, and then you have that sacrificial leaf that comes up. It's kind of really thinking about that.
So Lavon and I are going to leave you on that note where we really need to think about what we hold on to and what we let go. And I think it's a really deep process to really begin to think, share, and sit with it. So it was really my pleasure having Lavon here in the gallery today, Cane Roots Art Gallery. Please follow us. And actually, we're going to have Lavon back several times because we have only begun to touch the surface of this process about going deeper. So thank you very much for being with us today, Cane Roots Art Gallery. And we'll see you next time. Sonia Nahardin.
I used to watch BET, MTV, VH1, now I watch Tempo. Soca, Calypso, Reggae Dancehall. Don't stall, better get tuned in to the tempo. Don't have cable, they got an app. Go to your app store, download that. Whether it's tourism, cuisine, or the social scenes, if it ain't Tempo, it's a rap. Who got the Caribbean views? Tempo. It's the latest in Caribbean news. Tempo. You tryna cook Caribbean food? Tempo. You know they got the music videos too. Tempo. Who got the Caribbean views? Tempo. It's the latest in Caribbean news. Tempo. You tryna cook Caribbean food? Tempo. You know they got the music videos too. Tempo.